All right. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Christy Silva. My pronouns are she, hers, ella, para los hispanohablantes. And I'm the Associate Director for the Pacific Southwest MHTTC, but today I'm your moderator for this session. And I just want to warmly welcome everyone to this session, this lived experience panel. So it's titled Honoring Voices of Lived Experience and Allyship. And as we've heard today, lived experience and centering voice is really at the heart of approaching our work through harm reduction lens. And as the Department of Health and Human Services would put it, they offer to us that people with lived experience are those directly affected by social, health, public health, and other issues, and by the strategies that aim to address those issues. Well, what that means for us today is that by centering knowledge based on individuals' experiences, their personal identities, their histories, we can live into our commitment then to equity and equitable systems. So, okay, here's what our time together might feel like. First, just going to offer some housekeeping items, just like we've done for previous sessions. Then we'll introduce with whom we're in conversation, and we'll have a moment to ground together. Then we'll take the slides down and bring up the speakers. So we really want this to be a casual conversation, right? And so no slides, faces, to be together. And that'll be followed by an opportunity for our panelists to respond to questions from the audience, you. To center us, our intentions for this panel are, you may remember this from registration on our webpage, to learn about harm reduction in practice through 3 voices of lived experience and allyship. Going to identify policies and practices that support a healing-centered approach to harm reduction for individuals who have experienced harm. And we'll gain some concrete strategies and guidance for family, friends, other allies who wish to support the healing journey and the recovery journey of a loved one. We're so glad you're here and that you've made time in such a busy world for yourself and to be together and to learn it in community. So welcome. As I previously shared, this session focuses on person-centered work, learning from and with people who are experiencing harm reduction. That's caregivers, advocates, and system leaders. And over the next 90 minutes, we get to hear from 3 people who identify as folks with lived experience, so maybe potentially in recovery, or living experience, folks potentially engaging in use, and or as someone who is an ally or is in allyship with people with lived and living experience. A few more notes about our conversation today. This is not an all-encompassing conversation, as we've seen from previous sessions. Each session could probably be covered for days. But we do have boundaries on our time. And so there will be things maybe that you expect to hear today that you won't. And you'll likely hear about new practices, new experiences, new perspectives that you didn't anticipate. What I can say for certain is that the conversation will be rich and also bound to time and space that we have together today. So let's make the best of it and continue to be engaged. So as we've heard, and maybe a through line through our sessions, is that one of the tenets of harm reduction that we heard again in the opening and the keynote in the last session is to embrace people without judgment or requiring people to be a certain way to get support or approval. It is time to meet our panelists. So let's begin, meet our guests. Yeah, we'll spotlight our friends. So we have Janice Whitlock, Gabriela Zapata-Alma, and Dylan Thomas. And we invite you to check out the link in chat where you can find their full bios if you'd like to learn a bit more. And as we start, I want to take a moment to recognize that we are all in a really big moment of an individual and collective overwhelm, right? So there's the reality of youth experiencing mental health needs, pressures on providers, fentanyl crisis, the witnessing of suffering and war globally, just so much. And so we invite you to come in and focus on this conversation that Dylan, Gabriella, and Janice that might share something about their experiences that may activate or maybe evoke strong feelings or a response in the body. And so remember, we encourage you to do what you need to do to feel resourced, safe, present during the day. And that may mean that the nature of this panel may at times surface a need to access those resources and tend to ourselves. Maybe that means stepping away for a moment, or just turning to your resources and practices to stay grounded and regulated and present. Welcome, everyone. So good to see you again. I'm hoping you can introduce yourselves, starting with like name, maybe your role, location, pronouns, and maybe what the words safety, compassion, and dignity mean to you. Let's start with you, Janice, and then we'll move to Gabriella and then Dylan.
All right, thank you and welcome. And I'm so glad that I get to be here. And I have to say, whoever crafted these questions, I love them. Way to go. I can't wait to hear how everybody answers them. So I'm Janice Whitlock. I go by she, her. I'm 35 plus years in the field, primarily as an advocate for the first 12 years. I worked directly with young people on sex and sexuality, which was great fun. And then in the last 25 years, I was at Cornell as a research scientist. I was the founder of the Cornell Research Program on Self-Injury and Recovery and the co-founder of the International Society for the Study of Self-Injury. None of that was at all planned, just grew organically it's an interesting story I don't have time for, but I've learned a lot along the way. I'm currently sitting in Boulder, Colorado. Safety, because now I'm a consultant. I work with schools, communities, and individuals. Safety, I thought a lot about that. These are good questions. So safety, obviously above and beyond the things we all know. For me, the epicenter of safety is that it creates an environment that allows for the fullest expression of each human without fear of retribution, punishment, abandonment, or persecution. Compassion, I love. It's one of my foundational concepts for my own world and life. And for me, it really underscores the withness, to be with another, to be able to hold space, combines the body and the willingness to stand with somebody in suffering alongside the desire for the suffering to be alleviated, even if it can't be me that alleviates it. But the wanting of it is a core part of the witness. And then dignity is a good one, especially in the current moment. But I looked it up. The definition of dignity is the quality of being worthy or honorable, worthiness, worth, nobleness, or excellence. For me, dignity is intrinsic in all life, and the job of the collective is to assure that each individual has the tools and resources they need to be able to recognize their own worth, their own inherent worth and nobleness. We don't do so well at that these days. But I'm really grateful to be here with you all to work on that.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Gabriella, could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Gabriella Zapata Alma. I use they, them, and AJ pronouns. And I'm the Associate Director of the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. And I also have a half-time appointment at the University of Chicago, where I lead our training program for people who want to become certified alcohol and other drug counselors. And let's see, I am here in Chicago, the unceded homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Odawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi. And I find these words really important and really beautiful. When I think of safety, I think of not only physical safety, but that emotional safety. And that safety must be self-defined. And that far too often, things that are not healing centered, things that are unjust are done in the names of safety. And we have to be really critical and look at whose safety is being centered in those decisions and whose safety is being sacrificed. And that whenever we place the safety of one over another, we've already lost. That's not necessary, and it's not helpful, and it just breeds more danger and lack of equity and justice. Compassion, I think about compassion as the sincere desire for someone else to be well, for someone else to be free of suffering, for someone else to thrive. And then for dignity, dignity, I think of it as being inherent in each of us, not something that can be given or taken. And that we all have so much work to do to make sure that our services, our systems of care, our policies, our practices really live up to the promise of dignity and the reality of dignity that we all have.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Dylan Nason. I am a mental health professional, and I'm coming from lived experience. My lived experience brought me to a group called My Life, which is for young adults going through mental health issues in the community, where I started volunteering at and ended up facilitating with Magellan Health. These guys brought me to the National Federation of Families Conference 2 years in a row, where I was able to get workshops and also teach a workshop on what we were doing. Locally, I took part in a few different committees like the Young Adult Advisory Group and the Suicide Prevention Committee. And I've been trying to keep up a local presence ever since then. My pronouns are he, him, his, and the words safety, compassion, and dignity to me sound like a grouped up good combination, like soil for growth, right? For a flower. I feel like with safety, you're not in fight or flight. You're able to stay calm. With compassion, the people around you aren't bringing you down. They're not, taking you away from your goal, your focuses. And with dignity, I feel like that's a clear path forward. I feel like the opposite of dignity might be like shame. And shame is something that is going to pull you back from being able to grow. So those three words together, is a little good combination for some growth. Thank you for having me.
Perfect. Thank you, Dylan. Oh, the answer. What a great segue into our first 4 questions. So those will go to all our panelists who choose to respond. So let's get started. So healing justice, as we've heard throughout the day, is conducive to harm reduction because the process is holistic and compassionate, right? Seeking to repair harm and create change rather than to punish and isolate. So I'm curious then, what does healing justice mean to you? Why is it important to talk about healing-centered harm reduction?
To me, healing justice sounds like a means to an end. It sounds like I'm going through this treatment and eventually I will be better enough to not need continued treatment, that I'll be able to live on my own and be completely independent. Right now, I'm kind of in living experience, so I'm not quite there. I'm still looking for help. But the justice part comes with finding my own empowerment to help myself and then help other people around me afterwards. Kind of like this, getting to talk about my experiences. I feel like it's really important to talk about this and keep this conversation up because our culture doesn't really give off that vibe of we're going to help you heal and then take care of yourself. We're more like, oh, this has happened to you, so we're going to treat what happened to you. Like we're treating what's happening in the moment. We're not going to stop it or necessarily go back to the root. Now, when we're speaking of our culture, that is kind of like USA, big pharma is what everyone thinks about, at least surface level to me and the people around me.
I love that answer, Dylan. And I think you've especially touched on an important thing that's emerging is that there's really this digression between harm reduction and then like treatment recovery, right? Thank you for naming that.
I can jump in here because it's something I think a lot about. I mean, so much of our society, especially now, has been predicated on the dominance and suppression, wounding, and damaging of wisdom lineages, and there's lots of interesting reasons probably for that. We could be here all day talking about that, but it's really hurting us, right? I mean, we stand on the brink of all sorts of potentially cataclysmic moments historically, and so much of it can be traced to the damage that we've done to so many. And we need that wisdom now. We need the healing now, and we need the knowing that has come from that. So that's, sort of it's beyond just being able to leverage cultural resources to heal. I think it's being able to acknowledge that we need collectively what they have to offer. But there's a good amount of healing that's going to have to be done in order to be able to wholeheartedly make use of and offer those. So it feels absolutely instrumental in our evolution as a species at the moment, and maybe even our survival.
What I'll add to what my co-panelists have said, their brilliance, is that I really see healing justice and harm reduction as overlapping in a lot of different ways. Being connected to social movements where people with lived experience aren't just the recipients or aren't just the afterthought many times, but are actually not just involved, but leading the way that people with lived experience are the agents of change and are the people with the expertise. And that they also both focus on creating environments where healing is possible, right? That it's not just that we're just playing whack-a-mole with the different oppressive experiences and forces, but truly creating an environment that is conducive to healing. Now, when I think about kind of those words being put together and healing-centered harm reduction, I think that there's a lot of good that can come with that. I also want to caution us from kind of equating harm reduction and healing in a certain way, or kind of making this leap that sometimes happens when people talk about harm reduction, that it's like, we're doing harm reduction now, so you should heal, right? We're doing harm reduction, so you stop that. And so I want to be really clear that there's a lot of areas in life in which, and I would say whenever we're doing harm reduction, we're not doing it by prescribing a goal or telling someone, we're doing harm reduction, so you stop this, right? But that it really needs to be self-driven, self-defined, and that we need to make sure that it's power with, and we don't just kind of co-opt it ever and make it a power over thing. This goes back to the dominance piece that is so pervasive in not only our culture, but then it infiltrates our organizations, our practices. And so in that way, I want to caution us when it won't be healing centered if we're somehow assuming or demanding what healing looks like or what that means in terms of how we live our lives. And so within harm reduction, we accept that risk is a part of life, and we focus on well-being and quality of life for ourselves and for our communities as we define that for ourselves. And it took me a long time to realize that part of my desire for kind of healing everything that came up for me was actually veering towards this oppression, or excuse me, this perfectionism that was not only unrealistic, but was actually rooted in these oppressive ideologies that didn't allow me to be fully human and fully valid as I am right now in my moment, right? And so having kind of come to this point in my healing, I love to say that I'm a beautiful mess and I get to be a beautiful mess. And that's part of my birthright.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Oh, I especially love, Gabriella, the way you talk about how people can be active agents in their own journey, that are empowered and resourced and not considered passive recipients of care. I love that. I see that our conversation is also expanding the way that we talk about harm reduction, which leads us perfectly to our next question. So harm reduction has historically been thought of in relation to substance drug use. But what additional applications of harm reduction are emerging that should be elevated? And what does that intersection of mental health and harm reduction look like? And what does it feel like?
I can start on this one quickly because it stems up off of what Gabriella just said. I mean, to me, harm reduction is a pretty simple, not simple, but it's a concept that says we start with where we are and we go to where we want to go. But the thing that, and we do it step by step, you can't just leapfrog over all sorts of the processes. And why would you want to do that? Because so much growth can come from that anyway. There's a lot of beauty in that process. But I think one of the things that Gabriella pointed to that's so important is that it can't be my agenda. It has to be the agenda and the vision of whomever we're working with or loving or holding, right? It's what they want. And that's part of where the skill comes in. It's like helping hold a space for that. It's like, where do you want to go? And then how can we support that process? And really, as I said, focusing on the process as a place where wisdom and growth and self-knowledge comes from, because that, in my experience, has been one of the silver linings of struggle, is self-knowledge and compassion and wisdom to give others. So those are the elements that seem very important to me. And I think you can apply it to anything, pretty much anything. It's a concept that works across the board.
So for me, I would offer that harm reduction is a way of life. It's a way that we approach really everything under the sun. And so the only reasons why we have the words harm reduction is because of the stigma that exists around certain behaviors that get labeled as risk behaviors and certain behaviors that there's been this history of saying, absolutely not, under no circumstances, zero tolerance, and if you do engage in that, then stigma, shame, right? And so when we think about, really our approach to anything else in life that carries some form of risk, it is a harm reduction approach. And I think it's because we know and we have known that this is what works and this is what's possible, and that harm reduction is a really beautiful field that is so fertile and so rich with possibilities and with just like so much goodness that we haven't had to name it until there has been this stigma that is incredibly, incredibly damaging. So often the stigma is worse than whatever it is that we're being stigmatized for.
So I'm sorry, but I've been caught up on this question. Harm reduction is thought of alongside drug use. Now, the way this word is making me think of, going to a psychiatrist and getting medicine to start the harm reduction, right? Okay. That's what I was thinking. Additional applications of harm reduction that are emerging should be elevated. I'm sorry, I wrote this down and I'm like, gut health, yoga. I'm not sure if this is alongside the right conversation. I'm not sure if I'm like alongside drug use and harm reduction. This is how my mind went, right? For harm reduction, yoga, because yoga is going to bring you back into your center. Same with gut health. Fix your gut health and your mind's going to start to get better. So, that goes alongside with harm reduction for me. The drug use was confusing because Big Pharma kind of just seems like a bad guy to me. My experience with gaining medication, those type of drugs gave me a bad experience, so I don't relate those too well. I've had to, on my own, resort to like marijuana, which I believe has helped me with harm reduction. But at some point, that's still harmful. It's not helping me get to where I want to be. It's just kind of like slowing down or like hiding something. So additional applications besides drug use that would help harm reduction for me is that holistic approach of taking care of your mind and body, right? And then taking medication after you're at a point of clear, self-centered focus, because I feel like the medication can just fog things up even more, take you down a wrong path, is what I've seen.
That sounds spot on, Dylan. And I mean, the direction that your mind and from your experience, the direction it goes, that's exactly where it needs to be. And so earlier today, we did have a discussion about both the context of licit and illicit drugs and what that means. But, the imagery that I'm holding on to and that I've been hearing these words like fertile and planting seeds and things. So it brings us back to what you offered earlier about having this foundation, this soil from which flower or we as living things grow. So I think that sounds spot on. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, okay, if we're talking about healing practices, the healing practices of our ancestors have historically been taken from us by means of enslavement, imperialism, systemic oppression. So how has the reclamation of these ancestral, culturally rooted healing practices shifted the landscape of harm reduction, either in your practice or what you've witnessed? And maybe I'm curious if you have any stories you could share where you have experienced that reclamation for yourself.
Can I please start?
Yeah.
I was so excited for this question. Really beautiful, really beautiful. I don't think that fully we have reclaimed all of our ancestors' practices. I think that we're in the process of it, and I think people are talking about it, but it's still kind of not really fully accepted. And in my experience, I am seeing this in terms of religion almost, like practices of old prayer or ways that people prayed to God like back in the day are kind of like scaring modern day Christians, which I'm a Christian, I'm a born again Christian, I was born Christian, right? I don't want to offend nobody. But when I was going through what I was going through when I was self-harming, I was praying to God and I was looking for help. And I started looking for help in Buddhism, right? Because that's all peace. So I started with Buddhism, which led me to Hinduism, which led me to Judaism. And, I'm pulling in all these different cultures for help. And I'm starting to realize more practices, right, that I haven't had before from the past. And for example, Wiccanism, Wicca. Not a lot of people know about witches these days, but in my area, for some reason, there's a lot of people who practice Wiccanism, which is praying to Mother Earth, right? In my eyes as a Christian, I see God having 1,000 names. So to me, it's all God. I can accept it. I love my neighbor, and as long as they're not hurting nobody, I'm going to, support them how I can. So seeing the ways that Wiccans have practiced, like praying to God and self-empowerment, I can see that as self-healing, and I can also pick that up in my own practice. I want to give another example about how music has helped me with my practice as well. There's a therapy called IFS therapy, internal family systems therapy. And I believe that, I believe in the therapy, first off. And I believe that I am able to tap into deeper parts of myself through music, right? I'm writing music, I'm in the zone, and then suddenly I say something and it's like my 16-year-old self would have said that, and it feels like my 16-year-old self is talking to me from inside me, and that is healing. I'm able to talk to my younger self now. I'm able to get into the flow, and I'm just like, and it feels almost like I'm close with God. It feels like I'm healing myself and doing a wonderful thing and having fun doing it, which is like loving, and I'm loving myself. So that's something that I feel like is an ancient practice. You know, I feel like in ancient hoodoo or voodoo, like they were doing dance circles and singing to God and trying to like, you know, do these things. And God is also inside us. I feel like God is going to help these interactions, and God is going to help you to um, like heal yourself if you're looking for ways. If your way isn't working, keep looking.
So I want to say thank you, thank you, thank you, Dylan. Oh, it's so beautiful hearing about your internal experiences and you sharing that with us. There's so much you've shared that really stirs my heart and I can relate to. And there's just it's so much about kind of that reconnection, right? Um, so I think a lot of people are noticing that harm reduction is really well aligned with the traditional ways of knowing, the traditional values and ways of relating of many of our ancestors. I'm noticing that the reasons that we don't do things in a way that are, or when we don't do things that are aligned with harm reduction, it's because of having our traditional ways of knowing, our traditional ways of being attacked and validated, and all the different ways. And so I think that that, as we reject that and unlearn and then reclaim, we're also recognizing how these kind of dehumanizing and blaming frameworks just are harm layered on top of harm, layered on top of harm, and that these all or nothing frameworks can really be used and have been used as a tool of control and exclusion. It makes me think about Michelle Alexander in the New Jim Crow. She talks about how the kind of that societal oppression gets to define who has a problem versus who is a problem. And so I think that as we recognize more and more how these come together, we then are really, really fired up and empowered to reject those ways, recognize what the roots of that is, and then really reclaim that those traditional ways of knowing and being. And within that, we see that bear out time and time again that culture is prevention, culture is treatment, culture is safety. And so sharing examples from my own life, Dylan, when you mention there being the ancestral practices of dance and song, right? And connecting to what is holy through dance, through song. I remember for the longest time since I was little thinking to myself that I thought that dance was one of the things that was the holiest thing you could do to really praise spirit and connect with spirit. And then coming to learn, years and years later in that reclamation process, how that is something that has been practiced by my ancestors since time immemorial, right? It's not any kind of accident, right? And so I think that the more, especially when we are so disconnected and that has been stripped from us, and sometimes we're even having to reach back across generations because maybe the people that we were directly raised from have also had that stripped and haven't done that reclamation, haven't had maybe the opportunity or the safety to do that reclamation. We also have to really trust our own innate instinct and trust our connection with those ancestral practices, even when there's no one kind of around us saying, yeah, that's right, go for it, go for it. We have to be able to trust that in a world that goes, no, don't do that, right? I know for me, the first time that I lit Palo Santo and took in that healing smoke, I was like, what? This is it. I know that when I eat my traditional foods, oh, my daughter will eat things together and she'll go, oh, this must be the food of the ancestors. I love this. And I go, yes, baby, this is the food of the ancestors, right? And so even just reconnecting our sacred relationship with food in a world that has driven so much disconnection and really complicated that relationship with food. Um, it's all like food is medicine. And so, yeah, that's what I have to offer.
All right, it's hard to trump all that, but I'll just be really quick. And that is, I loved this question when I first looked at it. It made me really think. I think one of the greatest losses to humanity has been the suppression of put fill in the blank, lots of knowledge and cultures and peoples. It's been a terrible loss. And I'm a researcher, I'm a Western trained researcher in the Western world, but my heart really does belong to indigenous and primarily Eastern cosmologies. I'm a yogi. That's recognized that what can be sensed by the five senses is just the five senses we have is just a fraction of what is real and what is there and what we can interact with and what we can use to understand ourselves and to heal. So in terms of reclamation, I'd say one of the things I'm noticing in some of the, even the professional worlds I'm at, in even some of the Western conversations that are happening, is a recognition that it's not serving us to identify treatment or therapy or healing in the one particular way that we tend to do that we need to get kids and people into therapy and in it, we usually need to use the Western modalities. I mean, there's a lot to be offered there, but we're missing a whole bunch of really amazing tools. And it does seem to be being increasingly acknowledged. Don't know how fast it'll be to be integrated, but it does seem to be showing up as recognition. So yeah, sound, music, dance, food, traditional healing techniques, traditional healers, the curanderas, and the others that are indigenous to cultures where we tended to minimize and suppress them. I mean, that's changing. So I'm really grateful, and not just for individuals who get to access and not feel like they're having to sneak around the Western paradigm to do it, but for all of us, because there's so much there that for everybody to understand. So I think we're on the right path, but it's slow. Although here we are having this conversation, so that's good.
Mm,
Yes,
absolutely.
I'd love
If
to.
I could share one more time,
Oh, go ahead, Dylan.
let's have a good example with spirituality. With my diagnosis, major depressive disorder with psychotic symptoms, I feel like music, I feel like TV, I feel like some things can speak out to me, right? I've had issues with that before. Um, Now, I'm also someone who, throughout my healing journey, has not had a very strong support system. My family hasn't been very supportive. A large part of this has been on my own. My friends all abandoned me at the very beginning because my self harm was intense, that it scared them. So, this spirituality and this relationship with God was super important to me. And throughout my healing journey, um, the specific moment that I wanted to share was how Hinduism helped me in a moment when I was surrounded by my whole house was toxic. My whole house, I ended up leaving the house. I lost my job. It wasn't good. But in that moment, God lifted shame off of my shoulders. And what had happened was I started an addiction, really shameful. I was on the verge of hurting myself. And in Hinduism, I know that there's a god called Ganesha who is a elephant, and he's the remover of obstacles. Now, I'm watching a movie in my home, and all of a sudden, the elephant comes up on the screen. Um, and when the elephant comes up on the screen, my mind's triggered. I'm like, oh, look, God. But then the words that came with that image is what helped me. And how specific this could have been, any other day would never have happened. But it directly said on the TV, and it wasn't like I was hearing it on my own. Like the person with me heard it. It was part of the movie. It just happened randomly from what I picked. But um, the person that was with the elephant on the screen was talking about how it's not that person's fault for doing what they're doing. It was talking. They were giving advice. They were being loving and empathetic, and I received empathy from what my connection to God was when no one around me was giving me empathy. The TV had came in the form of Ganesha saying, "It's not your fault you're doing this, and you do not need to hate yourself for this," when that's all I was doing. And I saw that and it helped me right away.
Thank you, Dylan, for sharing that. I am also a lover of Ganesha, and so I have our Lord Ganesha here tattooed. I know, right? Like, what are the chances? And what I'll kind of offer here is that so very often there is this like kind of idea of there is either this traditional way or this Western way. And what I want to offer is that people have been doing healing work for millennia, and some of the most evidence-based and popular therapies actually have roots in traditional practice. And so there's like at the end of the day, like do what works. And usually we're all doing a combination of things. And what speaks to us in one moment or what works for us in one season of life may not work for us in a different season of life or a different moment. And something else I also want to offer, because sometimes people feel like, well, that's really neat that you have that, but I don't have that kind of traditional practice. And what I'll say to that is that we are all indigenous. It is only white supremacy that separates us from our indigeneity. And so we all have millions of ancestors behind us that have brought us to this moment. We all have traditional practices. And also, we many times need to bring those traditional practices into the present tense as well. That, there are certainly some things that I learn about ancestors doing, and I'm like, ooh, that might have worked in that cultural container for that time, and I'm not going to do that. Or maybe I can bring it forward into this way. And I think that that's some of the like really just beautiful pieces that we see in like Afrofuturism and all these different movements, that we're not just staying over here, right? We're also embracing our futures and our vision.
I love it. I love all of this. I knew this would have been going to be my favorite prompt for us. And so I'm going to keep with our theme of planting seeds and growing by planting the seed for reflection at the end of our session. As you mentioned, we are all Indigenous. And so I want us to be thinking about whether we are connected, seeking connection, reconnecting with that indigeneity, with our people, our past, our ancestors, ourselves, our lands, our practices. How can you or we, how can we begin to do that kind of work? And so I just want to plant the seed for all of us, not just our panelists here, but just to be thinking about that. We mentioned music, dance, for me, language, really finding the native language that was truly ours. Thank you so much for sharing. I feel like we could talk for hours about this. So I will, I'm going to take us in just a little bit of a direction now that that seed is planted, to ask, in your experience, what are the most effective approaches for families, friends, other allies to support the harm reduction and healing journey of a loved one? And maybe what are some signs that it's effective? Not because of what a result is or some sort of output or desired outcome, but just what can that maybe feel or look like?
I have a very specific example for this. A few years ago, my mom and I took a Reiki training together. We took Reiki 1 together, and it formed such a strong connection between us that had been lacking for a long time. And it didn't overdo it to like a weird, overbearing moment, but it definitely brought us closer together. And in my experience, I have a best friend who is autistic, and his mom does a lot of advocacy for people with autism. Um, and he struggles a lot with his diagnosis, but she does his trainings with him, and she goes alongside and does these things with him. And their relationship is super strong. I think that when family and friends can heal together and go through this together, that's really helpful. I had family therapy a long time ago, a long, long time ago. And the therapist gave us ideas to take home and practice. And we never did them. I wanted to, but my family never did. You know, it's hard to um, progress if you don't have people around you that want to. Um, so if you could, you know, give people trainings together, you know, that'd be helpful.
I love that. Thank you, Dylan. That's awesome. And I'm going to jump in here because something you said made me think of something that comes up all the time when I'm working with families. One is that first, I've done research on growth and healing in families around self-injury in particular. And I'd say almost 50% of people, at least in the studies, show growth as a family. So it can be like parents, in my experience, parents and loved ones need hope. That's the first thing they want. They want to know my child isn't irrevocably broken. They're going to have a life that's going to be marked by struggle forever. So that's the first thing we do is like, there's lots of hope. In fact, there's more than just hope. There's potential for extraordinary growth as individuals and as a family through the mechanisms you just talked about, through those processes of going alone. But I think the other thing that I give families that you also pointed to as much as I can is that, at least in my experience with the people that I tend to work with, I say, you know, people who self-injure or people who are struggling with anxiety are often extraordinarily perceptive. They have a gift or a set of gifts. It's just, we don't have frameworks for helping them understand what that is and how to work with it. And then how to, how to alchemize it and then how to use it. We're really early in that process still. But I would say like 100% of the time, parents are like, yes, I know. They're super sensitive, perceptive. Like they really, get a lot of information. So when we can shift the conversation into how do you acknowledge this as these perceptual capacities as a gift? How do you help co-regulate with? How do you stay supportive, open, curious, willing to take the walk with your child and not necessarily know exactly where it's going, but trust that if you can do those things, the chances that you're actually going to grow as a family and as people are pretty high, empirically speaking. It seems to work a lot. It works a lot better, and it's beautiful. I love to see what can happen with families as a result of having one or more of your family members challenged, by some really chronic dark nights of the soul. So thank you for speaking to that.
I love, love, love what you both offer for this question and for the whole panel. I want to speak to the experience of how kind of family and friends can show up, because when we become somebody who is studied and trained in the healing arts, one of the things I tell my students is you will help so many people in your lives, and at the same time, the same skill set may not help your own family and friends, the people you love most, right? Sometimes we're too close to it. And so when we can help all these people in our lives, and then when it's really personal and impacting someone we love, it can feel like all of that the anxiety goes up, the fear goes up, and with anxiety and fear, our ability to kind of think goes down, and our response often is either can be controlling, can be to disengage, or can be both. just because the pain and the worry can feel so overwhelming. And it is in these moments that it is that much more important to, when our inner voice is screaming, stop it, just stop it, right? If only we're that simple. It's so incredibly important to root ourselves in the caring, in the love, in the dedication and the core values of how we want to be and how we want to show up in this relationship with acceptance, with partnership, with empowerment, and a focus on what they think is important. Focus on what they want to focus on. What's beautiful is that even if, we might be saying, we need to focus on this thing, right? We need to focus on this self-injury. And they're like, no, I need to focus on like where I'm going to lay my head at night, right? Focus on the thing they want to focus on, because ultimately it's all connected within us, and it's going to help whatever that thing is that we feel like might be the priority in that moment. And if they're naming that as their priority, then that's where there's some hope and some space for some movement, right? And that within that, as that family member, as that friend, to also be sure that we're engaging in our own self-care and connecting in to ourselves and our own ways of being and caring for ourselves, because what isn't going to help is self-sacrifice, right? Self-sacrifice turns into just kind of this burnout and disengagement and control, and all these things come out, right? So as we're supporting loved ones in our life, also making sure that we're supporting ourselves throughout that. And so I just want to echo like what my co-panelists have shared is so phenomenal, and I'm just so glad to be a part of it with both of you, with all of you.
Mm. Wonderful. Well, we do have some questions coming from the chat, but I do have just a couple more that I want us to squeeze in. So, Dylan and Janice, I'm gonna direct this one for the two of you. So, since you both work extensively as advocates for and with young people, an essential part of advocacy is helping seemingly different people, maybe different communities, different and stakeholders understand each other's different languages and how to bridge and build a shared understanding with those differences in mind. So the question is, what kinds of language in this moment are we being called to maybe stop using, start using, and why?
If I could start it off, I'm going to piggyback what I said earlier about the different spiritual practices. That's what we need to start accepting more. A lot of people practice these already. A lot of people don't feel like they can talk about it. And not only that, if you're accepting to new practices, you might find something that's helpful to you. As far as stopping something, I'm not entirely sure. I remember having a conversation with my best friend's mom, who's in the mental health system and does a lot for advocacy. And she herself was skeptical hearing about like witch-like practices or Wiccanism, and she didn't like it because her spirituality got involved. And in my eyes, I thought that some of those things could really help out her child. And I'm not going to go out of my way I'm not going to interject because that's her baby. So it's not my place. But I feel like it made me sad because I feel like if she was more open to different types of, prayer, I feel like he would be able to relate to God more. I feel like we are definitely closed mind and stuck in the same old rigid practices.
I hadn't really thought about what we shouldn't be saying, but as I was listening to you speak, I was thinking I instinctively filter out language that implies hierarchy or values of hierarchy, and it's everywhere. I just change shape it in my head when I'm listening to it. I don't bother to call it out so much. It's just because it's so embedded in the structure of all of our language. But when I love the question focus, the aspect that's like, where can we go from here? Because it feels like, the answer immediately that came to mind was in the question itself. I mean, this is all about a time for bridging, right? But what seems to be really important for me is it's how do we commit to creating the spaciousness and the graciousness that's necessary to really listen to each other? Because it's one thing to like walk across a bridge if you can get there, but how you arrive and with what stance, what can you be open, curious, willing, able to really listen, understand from the perspective of, as close as you can get anyway, from those that you're bridging with. That seems to be the invitation of the moment and the necessity of the moment. And just, respectful curiosity is a huge part of the stance that I try to take in the world right now. But it's great because everything's are so much more permeable. Even though everything's falling apart in some ways, it feels like there's a lot more accessible than has ever been if you're willing to sort of sort through the broken stuff and start to think about what can we engender and build as we come together in new ways and as we open to different ways of knowing that have always been there but have been kept out by these hierarchies of value. I just feel a lot of people around me just saying, no more, done with that. Don't want to do that anymore. Let's create something totally new that allows everybody to blossom. So yeah, I'll stop there.
All right.
If I could, if you don't mind.
Yes,
Go
please.
for it.
I feel like something that we should start doing more is giving out more information, giving out more knowledge. For example, there are professionals on YouTube who teach people for free, and I haven't had a provider that has like sent me to any videos online to learn about anything. But when I went out of my way to do the research myself, I found a lot of people online that, are professionals. They have degrees that want to help people and they'll do it for free, or they have trainings online as well. There's someone called the Crappy Childhood Fairy, and she's on YouTube. She helps a lot of people. I learned limerence from her. I never heard limerence from any therapist, and I have problems with relationships. So that helped me out a lot. And I feel like if we shared more information like that, that would definitely help. My last girlfriend had BPD, and it was tough. But a YouTuber, right, who's a doctor and helps people with BPD a whole lot, helped me out a whole lot during that time period, right? A lot more than like someone local who might not have trainings about BPD. So sharing a lot of information, I feel like that would help.
The democratizing and decentralizing of knowledge. I love it, especially when that information is coming from people with lived experience. It makes me think of some of the people I follow on different networks that have really helped me to understand those internal experiences for experiences that I don't have lived experience around. And what's been helpful and how to reframe and, like even thinking about how the 99.9% of the research on autism are by neurotypical people. It makes no sense. Like, who's defining what the needs and questions are? It makes no sense, right? So for me, especially having that kind of background with substance use, there's so much stigmatizing language around substance use that I'm just like, done, we're done with it. Like, done, over, right? And so any language that implies a power dynamic or that implies kind of this very individualistic kind of blaming mentality around something, I'm like so over it. After that, I would say it's it's incredibly important to create and be open to and create opportunities for a real wide range of experiences and ways of describing those experiences. So, for example, one person might say, I have a genetic predisposition to ABC. And another person might say, I'm out here breaking generational curses, and this is what this means to me, right? And that to really create expansiveness for understanding how people experience what we might like kind of use a simple label for, how people actually experience it, and then going beyond those words and finding out kind of what does that mean for you and how does that inform what you see as kind of important or pathways of healing or however they, kind of define what their goal is as they're telling you about this. Um, and then I'll say one thing that gets like super on my nerves. This is just like the label du jour that I'm striking out of everything I see is the idea of coping mechanism versus coping skill. And I'm just like, why do we have to create a hierarchy of judgment with coping? Like, we are all bearing witness to this life, doing our best to live in the best ways we can. So, coping is coping is coping. And, you know, I'm not going to shame anybody's coping. And also, let's work towards a society, a community, an experience where we can have access to all the different things that we need and want, and not just have to survive our experience, but actually be well and thrive within our experiences. So that's one that I'm just like over coping mechanism, done.
I love the way that you've all shared about how you use your practice to reshape a culture and really sort of infiltrate systems for that change. Of course, I love the saying that culture eats policy for breakfast. So if we really do need to talk about systems and policy, then I'm curious, what are some examples of policy changes, whether that's from the language or the policy structure itself and the way it's implemented? What sorts of policy changes can mental health systems adopt so that they're integrating harm reduction, healing justice into those systems, right? And so, especially in a way that it can ensure that mental health is anti-racist, it is trauma-informed and person-centered. So, talking about practices and culture to influence policy, and now we're flipping the script to talk about policy changes that can embrace harm reduction and healing justice.
So one thing I'll jump in and just say real quickly is that funding drives model. Funding drives model 1000% of the time when it comes to systems of care. And so we need our mental health funding resources to recognize and compensate traditional forms of healing. And as I say this, there may be people here that are like, what? People would never do that. That would never happen. And I'm very happy to report that it's already happening in Hawaii, where Aloha Cares is compensating traditional healers as part of their formulary. And so, absolutely, our mental health models and funding need to be able to be more flexible, need to be able to be more holistic. If I can only, if I can, and I say this as a past mental health provider, if I can only bill if the person shows up, then how am I supposed to have assertive outreach that reaches the person who can't show up? So I can only build a model on people who are well enough to and have the resources to show up at a specific place in a specific time. That makes zero sense, right? So for me, like, funding drives model, and we need to really kind of overhaul a lot of the funding mechanisms to actually reach the people that want it, need it in the ways that they want and need.
I would just jump in too and say I think there's a place for courage to come in these like the more in the standard, like a lot of the rooms I end up in or have ended up in just don't acknowledge any other modalities but the ones that are evidence-based, right? And a lot of the other modalities are not, they don't fall in that partly because they just have never been assessed in that way. Sometimes they don't lend themselves easily to that kind of assessment, or there's just a stigma. We don't go there. But last big, I was in a suicide prevention conversation a couple of years ago, and somebody presented a slide with data suggesting we haven't moved the suicide needle at all. We really aren't doing a very good job on it. And I was like, okay, this will be interesting. What are they going to say they recommend? Because I'm thinking we need to get way out of the box here, right? Like we have nothing to lose and everything to gain by starting to really think and play with and allow a completely different way of thinking about this, including a lot of other approaches to thinking about death, dying, suicide, and healing than we've ever thought about before. And they got to the recommendation slide, and it was basically we need more money for more of the same. We're just not funding it enough. And I'm like, I'm done. Like I can't do this anymore. This is driving me crazy. Because we're like little rats on a wheel, keep going, going, going. So anyway, I feel like some of those conversations need to change, and I have started to broach some of that in some of those rooms. I gotta say, it's kind of a cold reception. It's just going to take a little while before people are comfortable allowing that these little box we're comfortable in is really because we're comfortable in it, not because it works so much.
Hey Janice, I would like to relate to you kind of. I was part of a suicide prevention task force here in Bucks County in Pennsylvania. It took us about 4 months just to make a poster to invite more people to the group. We were all getting stipends to go there too. Like it wasn't like horrible, but I just didn't see us like making a whole lot of progress. My friend actually ended up working for them and did take them in a new direction. It was really cool to see. But there's definitely some things that could change. And policy wise, when it comes to the mental health system, I would love, love, love to see people's diets and exercise be taken into account, so that people are the most clear-minded they are when they're making decisions for themselves. That's really what I need. I need to see that my psychiatrist, before talking to me about medicine, asked me, like, are you working out at least an hour a day? Like, are you getting that? Because you're going to be more sad and depressed if you're not. Are you eating healthy? Because where's your energy? What's your energy like? I don't have these conversations with providers, usually, at least. So if this is a policy, if, that would be amazing. I feel like that would make tremendous steps if we address people's exercise and diet in order to assess their mental health the right way. Otherwise I feel like we're taking people off of, their timeline. We're taking years off of people's lives because they're on medicine that doesn't help, or medicine that isn't, really meant for them. So
Yeah, and this
maybe also.
Go ahead, Dylan.
I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
I just thought of, like, I'm trying to think of my personal experience. And when I was in group homes for 3 years, one of the biggest problems I've seen was people who get comfortable in a group home and they're just there, they're not really healing, or their healing is mundane. Like they're just going through the everyday steps. By my 4th or 5th group home, I got a job and I saved up money and I moved out on my own. I made my way out of the system. But my friends are still there. Like I've had friends that are my age that they're still in group homes when I've been out for like since 2018. That's a long time that I haven't been in a group home, and my friends my age still are.
It made me think about how the example that you're giving, Dylan, it's like this isn't the only thing, but it's like kind of brings me back to that funding, right? And so knowing psychiatrists who want to spend a lot more time with people, who want to have in-house services and access to resources to support people with overall health, and then knowing that, what the pressure they're getting from insurance companies, sources of funding, right, is to keep it really discreet, to only talk about medication management, right? And that there are certainly some psychiatrists who are able to find the way to kind of buck the norm and create a different model. But if we want to really have a wide scale model that's much more holistic, then like we need to have the funding that incentivizes that and creates that the possibility for it. And thinking about my own experiences with medication, my first experience was awful. It was a terrible experience with medication. I remember calling my prescriber and being like, I don't think I should take this medication. And she was like, why not? And I was like, I don't feel sober on it. And she was like, what do you mean? And I was like, I'm seeing little people dancing all around me, like this. And she was like, no, stop taking it. And I was like, okay. And that really turned me off medication for a super long time. I was like, ooh, that's scary, right? It can be scary to kind of try at first anyways, right? And then the next experience of medication was really, really beneficial for me in concert with other things in my life, including stable access to income, safe home, safe family, surrounded by people who are nurturing connections rather than harmful and dangerous connections, right? And I remember being on that medication and thinking to myself, like, am I allowed to feel this good? Is it is it like putting me into euphoria? And it was like, oh no, wait, this is just what it feels like to not experience depression the way I've been feeling. Like, oh my gosh, like this is, oh, like, okay. I was worried that it was like giving me euphoria or something like that. And they're like, no, it's just addressing your depression. Oh. And so really there's kind of like honoring all the pathways and the pathways during different seasons, and honoring all the parts of the whole, right? So yeah, just want, and that our funding and our policies need to be able to honor that at the same time. And then, of course, honoring like what people are dealing with outside of the offices, right? That, for example, if we have a policy that people miss 3 times and then they're involuntarily discharged from services, like how is that actually honoring the reality of someone who doesn't have stable income, doesn't have stable transportation, doesn't have, if let's say they have stable income, but their work schedule is, they don't get to determine it and it's assigned to them on a weekly basis. Like when I was waiting tables, right? I would find out on Tuesdays what the rest of my week looked like. If somebody's experiencing stalking or intimate partner violence, that becomes, if I'm always where I'm supposed to be, then that just becomes a new place for me to be victimized and stalked. When I was a provider, I had people come in and say, oh my gosh, my ex was sitting in the car outside. My ex found me, right? So there's just so much around the funding that drives these really exclusionary policies that create, I mean, it's incredibly hard to access any kind of mental health care in this country, even when we're well resourced. That makes no sense. That makes zero sense.
I'm grateful for the way that you all have shown up and just been ready to jump in. I will plug as well, Gabrielle, you mentioned organizations that are the services that they're providing, the work they're doing in Hawaii. And so I hope you all will stay with us for the next session, which is when we will highlight the work that's being done in our center's region, that's the Pacific Southwest, coming up in just a bit for our next session, which is Regional Spotlights, Shining Light on Ways to Approach Harm Reduction in Practice. And so those, again, that's featuring regional spotlights from the Pacific Southwest. If you're not from this region, we want you to stay anyway, because there's, of course, great value in learning from others' work.